Good morning, everyone. So today we are going to jump into Module 30, which is about land management practices. And after this presentation, you should be able to explain specific land management practices for rangelands and forests, and then to also describe modern problems, contemporary problems in residential land use and some potential solutions, which I think is very relevant for everyone in this class, since you live most likely in a residential area. So land management practices are going to vary according to land use, such as rangelands, forests, and parks. And a rangeland is a dry, open grassland, which is primarily used for grazing cattle. And if you have too many animals, you can denude the region of vegetation. And once you've gone too far, you can actually pretty much ruin the land. So loss of vegetation can lead to land that's exposed to wind, water, and erosion, further degrading the quality of the soil and the land overall. Forest land is predominantly trees and other woody vegetation, and it's sometimes used for commercial logging. Approximately 73% of the forests used for commercial timberlands in the U.S. are privately owned. And these practices, the practices to basically manage forest land includes clear cutting and selective cutting. Clear cutting is when they're going to remove all or most of the trees in a particular acreage or area. They just basically clear cut all of the trees. So they're all felled, taken down. And then the second method is selective cutting, and that involves the removal of various trees or a smaller number of trees from the larger forest, and they're usually selected for one reason or another, such as it could be disease that has set in, it could be the age of the tree, the species of the tree. So there's more selectivity involved in the second option there. So this diagram here shows basically the two differences. This first one, you can see all of the trees have been knocked down, and all of them will regrow pretty much at the same rate. So you have no forest, and then you have all trees in the newly planted forest aging up at about the same time and rate. This is going to possibly be more problematic due to less resiliency by the forest overall. The second one here is the selective harvesting. So you can see that only a couple, 3, 4 trees out of this entire set of trees is being cut down. And so these larger adult trees are going to still be able to provide shelter, ecosystem services, still going through their adult cycle, seasonal cycles. And then these little guys down here are going to be younger, but they're going to possibly benefit from the larger trees being present in the area. A third approach to logging is ecologically sustainable forestry, and this has the goal of maintaining both plants and animals so that you're mimicking the most natural state as possible for the forest itself. And this approach is to remove trees from the forest in ways that do not unduly affect the viability of other trees that are not being cut down for commercial purposes. So again, increasing the resiliency of the forest overall. Reforestation, timber production presents many ecological challenges. Timber use is actually down in the United States quite a bit over the past 10, 15 years. All logging does disrupt local habitats. So whether it's the roads that the trucks are using to get into the forest area, or the fact that soil erosion has occurred because of the removal of the trees and their roots, and so The local creeks and rivers are polluted. There's various things that can happen when trees are cut down in large quantities. And it says here that logging often replaces complex forest ecosystems with tree plantations. And the definition of a tree plantation is just a large area that's planted with a single rapidly growing tree species. I like to think of Christmas tree lots when I think of tree plantations. Uh, Forest land comes with, and so does rangeland actually, but both types of land come with fire management concerns. In many ecosystems, fire is actually a natural process for recycling nutrients. So it's actually a good process that will cause older, possibly diseased trees to release their seeds. As the fire rages, it kind of pops open a lot of seeds and cones that can fall to the floor and then regrow new trees. However, when lots and lots and lots of acreage is involved, like we have seen in recent years in the state of California, it could be devastating and take up a huge amount of land. There's a couple of ways to approach fire management. One is a prescribed burn, which is a deliberately set fire. It's under controlled conditions, so they're very careful in how they approach this. They're watching the wind, they're watching the temperatures, they're watching the local humidity when they're prescribed burning, all in an attempt to be able to control, the fire and not let it get out of control. You should know that in '88 in Yellowstone National Park, there were huge, extensive areas of the park that were burned and probably could have been better if different management practices had been employed. National parks, another area of land, type of land, they're managed for scientific, educational, aesthetic, and recreational use. And overuse can introduce environmental features. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Human overuse can harm the environmental features that actually attract visitors. So again, whether it's for the aesthetics, oh, what a beautiful park Yosemite National Park is, or let's go and hike Yosemite National Park. If it's not managed carefully by the park system, the number of people and the number of users, obviously that can impact those qualities of the park. In these next couple of slides, actually, is it this one? Yeah, there's a series of vocabulary terms that you're going to need to know. One is the National Wildlife Refuge versus National Wilderness Area. I'm going to kind of skip through these. You definitely need to know the National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA of 1969, which is a U.S. federal act that mandated environmental assessments on all projects involving federal money or federal permits. So policy enacted to protect those lands. You need to understand what an environmental impact statement is, which is basically a document that outlines the scope and purpose of a development project. It would describe the environmental context. It would include alternative approaches to the project that could be considered that might be less harmful. And it'll analyze the environmental impact of each alternative. These EIS statements are also, as we talked about, different types of mining, surface mining, subsurface mining, and all of that. Whenever a mining company is getting ready to do work, it will have to fill out environmental impact statements. In fact, I think they have to do it yearly. At least the local mine here that I used to take my students to had to do that. An environmental mitigation plan is a plan that outlines how a developer will address concerns raised by a project's impact. So they're anticipating what could potentially happen or go wrong, and the plan has to outline and be prepared for that. And then the Endangered Species Act, another one for the APES exam that you're going to really need to know, of 1973, and this act was enacted to protect species from extinction. So that's another big one that you better put in memory. And then this next slide gets into residential land use and how it's categorized. You can be a part of a suburb, you could be a part of an exurb. A suburb is an area that's surrounding a metropolitan center with a comparatively low population density. So, San Francisco versus Walnut Creek. San Francisco being the urban center and Walnut Creek being kind of towards the suburbs. And then if you think about an exurb, it's very similar to a suburb, but it's not connected to the central city. So we could say San Francisco would be the urban center, Walnut Creek could be out towards the suburbs, and an exurb would be, for example, the city of Rio Vista. So there's definitely land separating, Walnut Creek, Pittsburgh, Brentwood, and then there's land before you get to the city of Rio Vista. So that would be considered an exurb. Since 1950, more than 90% of the population growth in metropolitan areas has occurred in suburbs. So people are moving to the suburbs. And 2 out of 3 people now live in suburban or exurban communities, oftentimes looking for larger homes, more land, quiet location, and so on and so on. This graph here shows quite clearly what has gone on since 1910. You can see rural kind of has stayed pretty much flat the same, but look at what has happened in terms of urban land use, greatly increasing number of people using that sort of property. This next one talks about urban sprawl and urban blight. Urban sprawl is going to be an urbanized area that spreads into the rural areas, removing clear boundaries between the two. So basically the entire San Francisco Bay Area is an example of urban sprawl from the city center, urban center of San Francisco. If you go to Sacramento, there are many cities that are connected to the city of Sacramento itself, also a good example of urban sprawl. There are 4 main sources of urban sprawl. One is automobiles and highway construction. So we have lots of tax revenue to build these roads and highways. And so it just makes it easier for people to travel from the suburbs back into the urban areas if they need to for work and so on. Living costs. Living in the city can be very expensive, and so oftentimes people will move to the suburbs to purchase a home that might be more affordable. Urban blight, we will get to in just a second, but basically that's a problem that can happen when a city loses revenue. And then government policies can add to urban sprawl or cause people to move away from the city. Urban blight is basically going to be the degradation of the built and social environments of the city that often accompanies and accelerates migration to the suburbs. And so if you look at this diagram here, and you start over here where the green arrow is, population shifting to the suburbs, what will happen is people say, oh honey, let's move to the suburbs. We can buy a home and we can have a yard for our kids to play in, and so on and so on. And so they make the move. And basically what happens is there's a loss of tax revenues for the city. So basically the city becomes less rich or less wealthy or has a decreased city budget. From there, the city might have to reduce services. So for example, bus lines might be reduced because there's not a lot of people using them any longer. That's just one example of service. Fewer customers are going to be shopping in the area. So then businesses decide to leave. And when businesses decide to leave, that's when you start to see neighborhoods decline because there's no economic opportunity for people to either exist from or live off of. So let's say Concord Produce If they're not there, they're not making money for themselves, and they're also not able to provide fruits and vegetables to the people of the monument corridor. So then what do? It boards up. The building becomes